So thank you all so much for joining today. Welcome to everyone on the line. My name's Tema Smith. I'm the Director of Jewish Outreach and Partnerships at ADL. I hope everyone is well and that you and your families continue to stay healthy and safe. I'm so glad you've chosen to join us for this timely conversation, an ADL briefing on the Boston Mapping Project. We'll dive into the specifics of what the mapping project is, but in brief, the Boston Mapping Project is an interactive map that calls to dismantle and disrupt Jewish and other organizations allegedly responsible for the colonization of Palestine or other harms such as policing, US imperialism, and displacement of populations. Today, we're going to dive into why this project is harmful and what the Jewish community can do now to combat anti-Semitism and hate. We're grateful for such a group of committed audience of Jewish advocates and community partners who have joined us for this briefing today, where we plan to shed light on the harms of the project, but also to discuss how we as a community can heal and be proactive against anti-Semitism. I'm joined today with two of my colleagues from ADL, who I will introduce briefly, and also a U.S. Attorney for the District of Massachusetts, Rachel Rollins. I will provide just brief bios of them, and then we will jump right into conversation. So Justin Finkelstein will be the first person I'm speaking with tonight. He's an analyst at the Center on Extremism at ADL. His research focuses on trends and developments within the American anti-Israel movement. He previously worked at American Friends of the Hebrew University, and he was an associate scholar at the Philadelphia-based Foreign Policy Research Institute, where his research focused on the Arab-Israeli conflict. Finkelstein was also a program associate for the study of the U.S. Institute on Religious Pluralism and Democracy, a State Department-funded program that brings undergraduate students from the Middle East to the U.S. for education about religious diversity, democracy, and dialogue. He holds a master's degree in Near Eastern Studies from New York University. Robert Treston is the executive director of ADL's New England office and ADL's vice president of the Western Division. He also currently serves on the Massachusetts Governor's Hate Crimes Task Force. He has represented ADL at the White House Summit on Countering Violent Extremism, where he raised concerns that anti-Semitism remains at the core of extremist ideology. He's part of an international team of prosecutors and hate crime trainers who provide training and support to various countries in Europe. And before taking the helm of the Boston office, Robert was ADL Civil Rights Counsel for 8 years. Rachel S. Rollins is the U.S. Attorney for the District of Massachusetts. Nominated by President Joseph R. Biden on July 26, 2021, and confirmed by the U.S. Senate on December 8th, Ms. Rollins is the Chief Federal Law Enforcement Officer for the District of Massachusetts and the first Black woman to hold the position. Prior to her confirmation, Ms. Rollins served as Suffolk County District Attorney for 3 years. She was the first woman to ever be elected DA in Suffolk County and the first woman of color to ever hold the position of DA in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Let's dive right in. I'm going to ask Justin to join me on the screen. Justin, thank you for being here with me tonight. Provide us a little bit of context. What is the Mapping Project, and what is it exactly about it that makes it anti-Semitic?
Sure. So you already started, but just to back up a little bit, on June 3rd, a new website emerged that consists of an interactive map purporting to show the connections, like you said, between organizations in Massachusetts that support, quote unquote, the colonization of Palestine and oppressive power structures such as policing, white supremacy, US imperialism, and more. And a number of anti-Zionist groups came out in public support, shared the materials on their social media. Those include BDS Boston, Tufts SJP, Tufts Labor, and other local groups. There's about 500 entities, as they call them, that are listed as being part of these oppressive power structures. They include Apple, Merck, Citigroup, and police departments, but also included, like you said, are dozens of Jewish groups that really make up the essential infrastructure of the Jewish community in Massachusetts. Further, addresses are provided for all the organizations listed, and language on each group's profile typically references alleged links to Zionism and Jewish groups, which makes clear that the non-Jewish groups are on the list overwhelmingly because they have interacted or have relationships with the Jewish groups. So who are the Jewish groups? The mainstays like Combined Jewish Philanthropies, ADL, JCRC, but also we're talking about the Jewish High School Gann Academy, the Jewish Arts Collaborative, the Synagogue Council of Massachusetts, and the Jewish Teen Foundation of Greater Boston, along with J Street and the New Israel Fund. Board members and donors are also named. And just a couple more points on what this is and what makes it so problematic. Like you said, the goal is to reveal, in their words, to quote, reveal the local entities and networks that enact devastation so we can dismantle them. And elsewhere they write that, quote, these entities exist in the physical world and can be disrupted in the physical world. We hope people will use our map to help figure out how to push back effectively. And they add that they support resistance in all its forms. So just one last point, who is, because it's a big question, who is behind the mapping project? We still don't know. We know its creators used a domain proxy service for their site. They registered the domain name back in December of 2021. We know the official BDS movement released a statement saying they had nothing to do with it. And we know that other groups, other pro-BDS groups like National SJP have doubled down in their support of the group, of the site, the mapping project. So that's in a nutshell what we're dealing with.
Great. Thank you so much for providing that really, really helpful context. What do you think this reflects about broader trends that you are seeing in supposedly anti-Israel spaces?
Sure. Yeah, this is really part of a bigger picture here. So despite the official BDS movement's rejection of the mapping project, the mapping project is just a particularly nasty example that's part of really a growing pattern over the past few years of many anti-Zionist pro-BDS groups and individuals, activists, calling for the complete ostracizing or boycott of Zionists and Zionist organizations, and focusing in particular on Jews and Jewish groups. So the general idea, again, prevalence in those spaces is that if you're a Zionist, you are complicit or you're personally responsible for the worst things you allege Israel has done to the Palestinians or to anyone. So some examples, for example, one is October in 2021, the DC chapter of the environmental justice group Sunrise Movement refused to participate in an event because of the inclusion of Zionist groups, and they called for those Zionist groups to be excluded from movement organizing. But only the Jewish groups that were slated to participate in this movement were mentioned, despite other participants holding similar views on Israel. The Democratic Socialists of America, this is another example, in November 2021, that's the Democratic Socialists of America, DSA, their BDS and Palestine Solidarity organization or wing said that they reject liberal Zionism in their membership, which leaves no doubt that they reject Zionism completely in their membership. Activists like David Miller, an academic in the UK who's also popular, been invited on at least one webinar with a professor at San Francisco State University, Professor Rabab Abdul-Hadi, has said many times that he wants all Zionist institutions to be dismantled, along with Lamis Deek, another popular anti-Zionist activist, a couple more at Tufts. The Students for Justice in Palestine group there started a petition in March asking fellow students to boycott a broad array of campus Zionist and pro-Israel programs and groups, including J Street, they focused specifically on Jewish groups and ignored others such as conservative Republican groups on campus. So we have, I'll stop there. We have those sort of examples, and there's many more, unfortunately.
Right, and I think as you're rightly pointing to, it's very telling in a project like the Mapping Project that the organizations listed run the gamut of Jewish communal organizations, some of which are explicitly Israel related, but even within those that are explicitly Israel related, running the gamut from New Israel Fund, who largely funds sort of social justice causes in Israel, and all the way over to the ZOA on the other end of the political spectrum with no differentiation, accusing all of them of the crimes of normalization, colonialism, and even listing Zionism itself as sort of a crime in some ways. Wonderful. Thank you, Justin. Is there anything else you feel that people should know about the mapping project before we turn it over to the Boston community, to Robert, to talk about the Boston community's response?
Yeah, I would say just in terms of what makes this anti-Semitic, since that's been a big question. Some people, debating in the larger community about what exactly the issue is here. Just a couple of points about what makes it anti-Semitic. So when they list most connected entities, for example, under media, 2 of the 3 are Jewish media. Well, what's missing from this list? Evangelical groups that are typically very supportive of Israel. Why are they not here? Whereas all these Jewish groups are. And I'll just add one more. You mentioned Zionism. They listed as a harm. The bottom line being, if you support the existence of the Jewish state of Israel, then you are slated for dismantling by this by the mapping project. And last, it plays into this trope that powerful and wealthy Jews are inordinately influencing global affairs. So how? I mentioned they list NGOs before. About 30 of those 38 NGOs that they list are Jewish, and they call them Boston Zionist NGO Circuit. They accuse them of funding violence worldwide. So this isn't just an accusation about what they might or might not support in Israel. And just to give one quote, and then I'll end there. They write that charitable giving about these NGOs, 30 out of 38 of which are Jewish. They write that charitable giving is a way for rich people to amass money, power, and then grant it as they see fit personally, enriching their allies and bypassing much needed resource redistribution. And they write, and this is really important, they write that the concentration of wealth in New England demonstrates the importance of combating Zionism locally. So I think that pretty much tells us where they're coming from. So that's all I would add.
One final question. From the tracking that you're doing and from COE's expertise, do we expect this to appear in other communities?
It's very tough to tell. We do know that the organizers of this website have said that they're more than happy to help organizers from other cities if they reach out. We have seen the former director of Jewish Voice for Peace, Rebecca Wilk-Homerson, come out and say, now let's do New York City. But we really don't know exactly where it would pop up next, except that we do know from that there's some, definitely support among the anti-Zionist groups and activists for its expansion into other states and cities.
Thank you so much, Justin.
Thank you.
And over to you, Robert. You really have been on the ground leading ADL's response in coordination with other organizations in Massachusetts. Can you tell me a little bit about how ADL has been responding and supporting our Jewish community partners on the ground?
Thank you. Thanks, Tema and Justin. Appreciate your analysis here. I want to make a couple of points, and I know that people are putting a lot of things into the chat. We have hundreds of people from across the country on the call, so we're not going to be able to do sort of an interactive Zoom conversation tonight. But I want to make a couple of important points. One is that the mapping project isn't just sort of there are 2 components. There's the anti-Semitic component that Justin's talking about, and then there's a security component. And so the language that they use, and I'm not advocating that people go and spend time on their website right now, because just keep in mind that you go there like so many other sites, they're collecting cookies and data. And I'm not talking about, the cookies that you might eat as an afternoon snack, but they're using the words dismantle of Jewish institutions, dismantling of networks. And they're also using the word devastation because of the devastation, their word, that these networks and institutions cause. And then they juxtapose that with language of every institution, every network has an address. They talk about how every institution has a physical address. And then they take the time to actually publish and, within the site, addresses of organizations, addresses of philanthropists within the Boston community. And it's the combination of all of this that I think creates a serious security threat and concern amongst many, many people in the Boston area, not just the ones that are named. So when you think about school safety in the United States, and then you suddenly publish the name of a Jewish day school, high school in the Boston area, along with the names of the leadership of the school, that's going to cause an obvious concern. And so it is this combination and the sort of uniqueness of this whole situation that I think has caused the community to be very, very, very concerned. And I will say, going along with what Justin was saying, that there are some pretty concerning groups that are advocating, supporting the mapping project and what it stands for and its call for dismantling. Just yesterday, the Iranian media, published an article supporting it. The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which is a recognized foreign terror organization in the United States by our government, our State Department, has endorsed it. And so this is really a concern. And I think from the ADL perspective, I think from many leaders in the country, when you see all of this, and you juxtapose that with the sort of high level of violence, and then we're going to hear from U.S. Attorney Rollins in a few minutes, and I can tell you from personal experience, she is someone who has been on the front lines of some of the violence that we've seen directed against the Jewish community and the communities of color in the Boston area. It creates a concern that someone will be incited, someone will be inspired to commit an act. And I think that is kind of at the center of what the concern is. And when you dig into this map, and I'm just sort of address like one or two of the questions that are in that chat, the Jewish institutions are like the pin in the middle of the map, and everything spreads from there, including sort of blaming them on every single ill, not just in this country, but in other countries. And I'm not saying that the creators of the map, maybe the creators of this, we don't know who they are, had an intention to commit violence, but we do know that there are people within the borders of our country, let's just say broadly, who want to commit acts of violence, whether it's against the Jewish community or it's against another community. And that's what creates a very serious concern. I just going on, I see there's a lot of questions in the chat just about where it's being hosted and how issues around terms of service. The site was initially hosted in the United States. It is no longer being hosted in the United States. They moved offshore very, very quickly. ADL did some work. It was not hard. Anyone can go and sort of figure out where websites are being hosted. They were hosted in Europe for a very short time. And I think I can tell you they're being hosted in Iceland right now. That's where the actual site is. For most people who may be seeing it, that movement kind of happens seamlessly, but they are not being hosted in the United States at this time.
What are you hearing from community members? How are members of the Boston community responding to this? How is the community mobilizing to protect itself? And how's the ADL supporting there?
We've heard from many corners of the community. So On the one level, there is sort of synagogues, the Massachusetts Council of Synagogues, which is the umbrella group for every synagogue, most synagogues in the state, is named. And we have done some outreach and really encourage people to be very, raise their level of security consciousness. I'm not going to speak about specifics in terms of security because, we don't want to publicly talk about security measures. But I think it's fair to say that many of the institutions are on a higher level of alert. And it's not just the sort of quote unquote Jewish institutions. There are Jewish physicians who are engaged in saving lives, working at some of the best medical facilities in the world, really, here in Boston, that have been named, as well as their research centers. And so I know from some of the people in those spaces, one, there's a sense of personal security. Like they've decided to, essentially name and shame Jewish physicians who are engaged in saving the lives, anyone's life, irrespective of who they are. I think that's a concern that should be a concern of all of ours. And there is certainly a concern that this could, the map could, and we could end up seeing a map in another city, in another part of the country. If our own sort of monitoring tells us that there are tweaks being made to the mapping project. Since it launched a couple of weeks ago, more and more institutions are actually being added.
I'm seeing a lot of people asking in the chat, why Boston? Why is the Boston community the community targeted here? And I know that we obviously don't know definitively, but any sort of a sense of why something like this might have taken place in the Boston area?
I don't know the answer to that. I think it's a good question. We may actually find out. I think at some point we will find out who's responsible. It's possible we have hundreds of people who are on this call right now. It's possible that people responsible are watching and listening, and I would encourage them to identify. We have a long history in this country of people disseminating hatred and engaging in violence against different groups and individuals because of their identity and using a mask to hide their identity. And there may not be a physical mask in this case, but there's a technological mask. So I don't really know. Justin alluded earlier to BDS Boston. BDS Boston is another sort of unidentifiable group online who has been one of the main disseminators and supporters of the mapping project. There was also a question in the chat around the sort of global BDS, which stands for the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions Movement. The Global BDS National Committee did write a letter to the Boston group asking them to disassociate themselves from the mapping project. And if you look at the language of their letter, they say the BDS movement is a nonviolent movement. And the mapping project has, I'm paraphrasing what they wrote. They say the mapping project has actually violated that condition of a nonviolent movement. So that tells us something that even the advocates of BDS who want to adhere to nonviolence in pursuit of their goal of political change in Israel are saying that there's a problem. So I'll make one last point, and I think we should give U.S. Attorney Rollins an opportunity to brief us as well. This is not about political. This is not about political speech. This is crossed the line. Political speech is okay. It's okay to disagree with a policy in Israel or any other country. Probably every person on this call has engaged in criticism of the U.S. government at some point in their life. And, political criticism and debate and dialogue is okay. It's not okay when you're going to cross the line and call for the dismantling of institutions and putting people's addresses and names and calling for this kind of action.
Thank you so much for that helpful context from what's happening on the ground. We have been talking a lot internally about the number of hours that the New England ADL team has put into this. And Robert, thank you and the rest of your team for everything that you're doing to work to get this down and to support the community at large and work in partnership with Jewish agencies all across the Boston area. U.S. Attorney Rollins, thank you so much for joining us today. I am really interested to hear from you a little bit about this issue from your purview as U.S. Attorney. So can you tell us a little bit about how your office and other law enforcement is intervening here? Is there an investigation? Has a crime been committed? Fill us in.
Yes, and I would first and foremost like to thank you for allowing me to speak here. I did want to say some of the great comments in the chat I agree with about why Boston. I mean, we are leaders, and the Jewish community are as well leaders and exceptional in areas of education, hospitals, health, life sciences. We are leading the country and the world there. So I think a lot of times people may want to target us because we are leading in so many ways, and the Jewish community is at the forefront with several other communities of being exceptional there. Yes, so I want you to hear me say, as the Chief Federal Law Enforcement Officer for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, why I'm on this call, why my first assistant, Josh Levy, is on this call, is because we care about these issues deeply. We are fully aware that there is a very strong, generally speaking, anti-Jewish sentiment. We need to be open and honest about that. We need to talk about when things are hate crimes and call them what they are. We are so lucky to have Robert leading the ADL here in Massachusetts, where he is boots on the ground, not just for the Jewish community. Sadly, when we see situations like, you know, a firebomb at the entrance of a Jewish nursing home, which happened when we sentenced a man, Mr. Rathbun, who did that, or indicted someone with respect to setting fires at Jewish affiliated institutions in Massachusetts. That's the Giannakakis case, which the U.S. Attorney's Office has been involved with. Robert not only shows up to those situations, but as an ally when the LGBTQ community is targeted or the Black community. He is truly a leader about what it looks like to not only protect the people that you love, but understands that when other people are targeted as well, it impacts all of us. And to piggyback on what he's saying, I do believe that this language is dangerous, for sure. When we look at the website, and I agree with Robert, we don't want to give these trolls the indication when they see, oh, look, 1,000 people went to our website. We know we're going there because we're disgusted with what we're seeing, but they're going to try to turn this into, we have more people that support what it is that the hate that we are spewing, the lies that we are saying. So, you know, one of the things on their website, it says, our goal in pursuing this collective mapping was to reveal the local entities and networks and enact devastation so we can dismantle them. Every entity has an address, every network can be disrupted, but we also know that they listed people's home addresses. So, you know, the special agent in charge of the FBI, Joseph Bonavalenta, takes this very seriously. This is public, right? Because there has also been a letter that was sent to Merrick Garland, the Attorney General of the United States, and the Honorable Christopher Wray, the Director of the FBI, from the Zionist Organization of America. I have a copy of that letter as the United States Attorney here in Massachusetts. We will be discussing this matter, and we are watching it very closely. It is important for me to say And I feel the frustration when people might say, my God, what more needs to happen? Do we have to wait until, heaven forbid, somebody takes action and harms someone? We saw what happened at Tree of Life shortly ago, only, November 4th, 2018. Locally, we've seen in Boston, Rabbi Naginsky was stabbed and nearly murdered, quite frankly, back on July 1st of 2021. We're coming up on the 1-year anniversary of that. And then we just passed the 1-year anniversary of Nathan Allen, who was an anti-Semite and a racist who killed 2 Black people in Winthrop. But I am very convinced that due to the horrific anti-Semitic information on his phone when he crashed, that he was actually on his way, had he not crashed his box truck, to a Jewish community right around the corner from where he murdered 2 people. So hate crimes are real. Anti-Semitism is real. Anti-Jewish sentiments are real. And what we need is law enforcement to not be afraid to say that, but also to let you know that if we haven't reached a point yet where it is a crime, that you not feel as if we don't care or that we don't take this seriously. But I intend to call Robert after this, and I intend to speak to the special agent in charge of the FBI. But we are going to show up, Josh Levy and myself, to make sure we're hearing the concerns and we are leaving no stone unturned, because I do not want to wait until someone actually takes up this entity and shows up at one of these addresses and does something to harm property or, heaven forbid, a human being, both of which are protected under hate crime state laws and other laws in Massachusetts.
I just want to add one point, Emma, and that is when this, within the first, hours of this happening, the first call is to Rachel and her team and the FBI. And so it's the relationships. And for those of you outside of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the relationships that I think have been built in at least, in our state over the last couple of years, those relationships are there when there's a crisis, but also when things are good. And that's why when this happens, when I make a phone call or one of my colleagues, from the Jewish Community Relations Council or another organization makes a phone call, the call is answered. And so I do just want to personally thank Rachel and her team. We are lucky that the relationships exist and that they prioritize this immediately. So it definitely, I think it adds to the sense of, as much as we're talking about a security threat here, her presence and the work that is being done behind the scenes by Justice Department officials and other law enforcement officials, that actually provides security to us. That allows people to go to school and go to work and sleep a little bit better at night. So I do just want to say I'm grateful for that. And I do think it's a best practice for other communities to learn from.
Yeah, thank you for that, Robert. I think it's so it's so valuable, and it's one thing that I'll say, because I know people are joining us from across the country. These are the kinds of relationships that our ADL regional team builds in the cities in which they operate, in the states in which they operate. So whether the mapping project, or if the mapping project, I should say, shows up elsewhere, rest assured ADL regional teams will be in touch with U.S. attorneys and FBI all over the country. Rachel, the community, as I'm sure you're seeing pop up in the chat and hearing as well from Robert, is so grateful for the support of the Department of Justice and your office. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the work that you're doing to combat the disturbing rise in anti-Semitism we're seeing?
Yes. So one of the first things, I have the pleasure of serving as the U.S. Attorney for the District of Massachusetts now. That's a presidentially appointed role. Prior to that, I had been a fan of Robert before I became the DA and knew who he was, but I had the privilege of standing in solidarity with him in some pretty horrific situations, like we talked about earlier when I was the elected district attorney, so the chief local law enforcement officer in Boston, Chelsea, Winthrop, and Revere. And, you know, what I think we need to do better, and what I'm proud of what we did, is we weren't afraid to call the stabbing of Rabbi Niginsky a hate crime. We had to make sure we did our work, and we did our work with the FBI. But, you know, sometimes laws are archaic, where there is a requirement. You know, when the law was originally written, let's say hypothetically, the way crimes looked were, you know, somebody would be committing a violent act while yelling a racial slur, or, you know, committing a violent act. And sadly, you know, we can think of no more repugnant and what's the right word? Like clear signal of hate than a swastika, right? That doesn't leave anything to the imagination. But if someone doesn't do that, if someone doesn't yell something about the rabbi being Jewish, there are individuals that may think, not in my office or the offices I lead, but did they say anything about him being Jewish? Stop it. This rabbi was standing in front of a 30-foot menorah with, you know, traditional dress as a rabbi in front of a Hebrew day school with a van that had English and Hebrew on it and a Star of David. I don't need the individual that stabbed him out of anyone else to also go so far as to say something anti-Semitic when it happens. So what we need is not to be as literal and rigid, and we will not lose that case. But I would absolutely every time charge that as a hate crime, because we know it's the right thing to do, and either get a not guilty on that, but maybe a guilty on just the, you know, armed assault, or the, you know, assault and battery, or what have you, or the other charges. But we can't be cowards and not say out loud when we know what the intent is of these vile acts. And I saw in the chat, someone is absolutely right. It is disturbing that people, you know, our First Amendment matters, and people can say things that literally make your skin crawl. But when they, you know, when is it a threat? Right. And what Robert and I talk about, you know, often when we see each other is, you know, our communities share the fact that, to me, a swastika, in addition to statements, that doesn't leave anything to the imagination. Right. And we are working with the FBI about that. When you know, we want to see, and again, I'm sad that this is happening, but if it gets to the point of where we believe it's a threat, we believe we've crossed that threshold, is when criminal charges can potentially be brought. But we need to find out who is doing this. And, you know, it goes more to the cowardice, right? Of when we have political discourse. You know, I've seen Robert say out loud things to people and said, wow, you know, good, you know, he said that right out loud to that person because he disagrees with them, but he respects them enough to say this to their face and to say, I disagree with you, and that's anti-Semitic, and don't you ever again, right? But that's not where we are now. I think we've moved to a space where we're going to be speaking with the FBI, and Josh Levy, the first assistant, and I are going to be talking about this likely after this call to say, when does that one last grain of sand tip the scales to going from free speech potentially to us saying this is dangerous and it could be a crime? And what are we going to do with our federal law enforcement partners or our state law enforcement partners to see what we can do to root this out?
Thank you so much, Rachel, for those reassuring words.
And I'll just sorry, Tim, I'll just say
go ahead.
For everyone that's listening, if you listen to what Rachel's saying, it's really important because like the work is happening now. Like we don't want to be doing this work months from now, later on. And so I think, you know, everyone, when you leave the call, you should know that like there are things that are happening in real time. This is not a discussion of what we're going to do. You're hearing about things that are happening to keep people safe and to ensure that, you know, our system of justice is applied fairly in you know, fairly consistent with the law.
And I want to make sure I say, I know I try to claim Robert to myself in Massachusetts. One of my dear friends, Dick Glovsky, just sent me a text and said, hey, Rollins, Robert is the director of all of New England, the New England region. So he's doing good work everywhere. I'm just claiming him right now. And I know you're also the VP of ADL's Western region. So Dick, I'm sorry. I understand he does a lot of good work, except Connecticut. And Robert does good work everywhere. But tonight we're talking about Boston, Massachusetts.
Thank you so much. Rachel, thank you for your reassuring words. I don't know how much you've seen what's popped up in the chat, but it's just been thanks from numerous people on the call today for your support of the Jewish community always, but especially now. And Robert, thank you again on behalf of the Jewish community and on behalf of the Boston community and on behalf of all of your colleagues at ADL for all of the work that you are doing. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. So I want to tell you all a few actions that you can take in order to help fight anti-Semitism. There is an action that you can take. I see that Robert just posted it in the chat here, Massachusetts Against Anti-Semitism, where you can sign on to a statement against the mapping project and anti-Semitism in general. Yesterday, ADL released a policy platform, our Combat Plan. Combat, of course, is an acronym for Condemn Anti-Semitism, Oppose Hate and Extremism Driven by Anti-Semitism, Make Communities Safe from Anti-Semitism, Block Anti-Semitism Online, Act Against Global Anti-Semitism, and Teach About Anti-Semitism. This joins two other plans, our Protect Plan on domestic extremism and our Repair Plan on online hate. And this rounds out our national advocacy agenda. You can learn more about that plan and take action by contacting your elected officials, urging them to speak out at a link that Maddie from my team at ADL will put into the chat now. And following right on the heels of Combat, this is a Jewish community call after all. My team released a new program. Applications are open today for a synagogue engagement program called Kulanu, Synagogues in Action Against Anti-Semitism. This program invites synagogues to put together working groups starting after the Chagim, after the Jewish holidays in the fall, to do programming in their synagogues as well as in the broader communities around anti-Semitism and hate, engaging community partners in the fight against the oppression that we as Jews face and other communities also face. The application's open today, so for those of you involved in your synagogue, you can learn more about it. Maddie just put the link into the chat now. We will be following this up, of course, with an email with all of these links as well as a recording so that you can watch this again if there's anything you missed. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all of the questions, but we did our best with the number of people on this call today. Thank you again to Justin, who you remember started this call with some helpful context, and Robert and Rachel for the work that they are doing on the ground in their respective roles in addressing the mapping project and anti-Semitism more generally. And thank you all for taking time out of your evening. Have a wonderful night, everybody.